Okay, next Form 170. You open this up, it's called consent to advertise. And what this is under TRESA, you need consent in order to advertise anything that happens after the sale. So you can see it's Form 170, consent to advertise. The brokerage, including their representatives, are required to comply with the Trust in Real Estate Services Act, TRESA, and other legislation where there are provisions to obtain consent before identifying certain information related to a transaction. So you've got the buyer and the seller and the brokerage here, and then the address. And then you've got three sections. First section is the seller and buyer consent with their initials to the brokerage, including without limitation any sales representative or broker employed by the brokerage advertising the sale of the property, including the sale price or any other terms of the agreement of purchase and sale. So if they check this off and initial it, buyers and sellers, then you can advertise that you sold this house for X amount of dollars. Here it might be it was sold in multiples for X amount of dollars. So you write in the remark what you want to do, but you'll see right underneath for consent to be effective, the above items must be initialed by both the buyer and the seller. Part two, the seller or buyer consent with initials to the brokerage, including without limitation any sales representative or broker implied by the brokerage advertising the sale of the property, including anything that could identify any party to the sale or purchase. So if you cut this off and say, congratulations to John Doe and Jane Doe, that what we got, Joe Doe and Jane Doe on the sale of their property, you could get in trouble unless you've got consent to do that. So that's part two. Part three, the seller or buyer consents with their initials to the brokerage, including without a limitation, any sales representative or broker employed by the brokerage advertising the sale of the property, including part one, anything that could identify the property is sold. Example, a sold sign, flyers, social media, etc., or anything that could identify the property. So if you're advertising this property on social media and you've got a picture of it, and you can identify that house and you say, okay, this house sold for $500,000. Without consent, you're going against TRESA and you could be fined. So again, anything that identifies the property in social media or anything that could identify the property by words, you could say, 123 Main Street got sold for this amount of money. So that's what you have to get consent for on part three. Again, consent to be effective must be initialed by the seller before closing and the buyer after closing. So interesting that it's the buyer after closing because it would have been sold, right? And then they all witness, buyer, seller, everybody signs here and dates it. So this is Form 170, the consent to advertise. If you're doing any advertising of your property that you want to have the price included, the sold, the names, anything like that, you need to get Form 170 signed by both the buyer and the seller.